The Peasant Marey. Excerpted from The Diary of a Writer, Volume 1, by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Translated by Kenneth Luntz. But reading all these professions de foi is a bore, I think, and so I'll tell you a story. Actually, it's not even a story, but only a reminiscence of something that happened long ago, and that for some reason I would very much like to recount here and now, as a conclusion to our treatise on the people. At the time I was only 9 years old. But no, I'd best begin with the time I was 29. It was the second day of Easter week. The air was warm, the sky was blue, the sun was high, warm and bright, but there was only gloom in my heart. I was wandering behind the prison barracks, examining and counting off the pails in the sturdy prison stockade, but I had lost even the desire to count, although such was my habit. It was the second day of marking the holiday within the prison compound. The prisoners were not taken out to work. Many were drunk. There were shouts of abuse, and quarrels were constantly breaking out in all corners. Disgraceful, hideous songs. Card games in little nooks under the bunks. A few convicts, already beaten half to death by sentence of their comrades for their particular rowdiness, lay on bunks covered with sheepskin coats until such time as they might come to their senses. Knives had already been drawn a few times. All this in 2 days of holiday had worn me out to the point of illness. Indeed, I never could endure the drunken carousals of peasants without being disgusted, and here in this place particularly. During these days even the prison staff did not look in. They made no searches, nor did they check for alcohol, for they realized that once a year they had to allow even these outcasts to have a spree. Otherwise it might be even worse. At last anger welled up in my heart. I ran across the Pole Emke, a political prisoner. He gave me a gloomy look, his eyes glittering and his lips trembling. "Je hais ces brigands," he muttered, gritting his teeth, and passed me by. I returned to the barrack, despite the fact that a quarter-hour before I had fled half-demented when 6 healthy peasants had thrown themselves as one man on the drunken Tatar Gazin and had begun beating him to make him settle down. They beat him senselessly with such blows as might have killed a camel, but they knew that it was not easy to kill this Hercules, and so they didn't hold back. And now, when I returned to the barracks, I noticed Gazin lying senseless on a bunk in the corner, showing scarcely any signs of life. He was lying under a sheepskin coat, and everyone passed him by in silence. Although they firmly hoped he would revive the next morning, still, with a beating like that, God forbid you could finish a man off. I made my way to my bunk opposite a window with an iron grating and lay down on my back, my hands behind my head, and closed my eyes. I liked to lie like that. A sleeping man was left alone, while at the same time one could daydream and think. But dreams did not come to me. My heart beat restlessly, and Emke's words kept echoing in my ears. Je hais ces brigands. However, why describe my feelings? Even now at night I sometimes dream of that time, and none of my dreams are more agonizing. Perhaps you will also notice that until today I have scarcely ever spoken in print of my prison life. I wrote Notes from the House of the Dead 15 years ago using an invented narrator, a criminal who supposedly had murdered his wife. I might add, by the way, that many people supposed, and are even now quite firmly convinced, that I was sent to hard labor for the murder of my wife. Little by little I lost myself in reverie and imperceptibly sank into memories of the past. All through my 4 years in prison I continually thought of all my past days, and I think I relived the whole of my former life in my memories. These memories arose in my mind of themselves. Rarely did I summon them up consciously. They would begin from a certain point, some little thing that was often barely perceptible, and then bit by bit they would grow into a finished picture, some strong and complete impression. I would analyze these impressions, adding new touches to things experienced long ago, and the main thing was that I would refine them, continually refine them, and in this consisted my entire entertainment. This time, for some reason, I suddenly recalled a moment of no apparent significance from my early childhood when I was only 9 years old, a moment that I thought I had completely forgotten. But at that time I was particularly fond of memories of my very early childhood. I recalled one August at our home in the country. The day was clear and dry, but a bit chilly and windy. Summer was on the wane, and soon I would have to go back to Moscow to spend the whole winter in boredom over my French lessons, and I was so sorry to have to leave the country. I passed by the granaries, made my way down into the gully, and climbed up into the dell. That was what we called a thick patch of bushes that stretched from the far side of the gully to a grove of trees. And so I make my way deeper into the bushes and can hear that some 30 paces away a solitary peasant is ploughing in the clearing. I know he's ploughing up the steep side of a hill and his horse finds it heavy going. From time to time I hear his shout, "Gee up!" I know almost all our peasants, but don't recognize the one who's ploughing. And what difference does it make anyway, since I'm quite absorbed in my own business? I also have an occupation. I'm breaking off a switch of walnut to lash frogs. Walnut switches are so lovely and quite without flaws, so much better than birch ones. I'm also busy with bugs and beetles, collecting them. Some are very pretty. I love the small, nimble, red and yellow lizards with the little black spots as well, but I'm afraid of snakes. I come across snakes far less often than lizards, however. There aren't many mushrooms here. You have to go into the birch wood for mushrooms, and that's what I have in mind. I liked nothing better than the forest with its mushrooms and wild berries, its insects and its birds, hedgehogs and squirrels, and with its damp aroma of rotting leaves that I loved so. And even now, as I write this, I can catch the fragrance from our stand of birches in the country. These impressions stay with you all your life. Suddenly, amid the deep silence, I clearly and distinctly heard a shout. "There's a wolf!" I screamed, and, beside myself with terror, crying at the top of my voice, I ran out into the field, straight at the ploughing peasant. It was our peasant Marey. I don't know if there is such a name, but everyone called him Marey. He was a man of about 50, heavy-set, rather tall, with heavy streaks of gray in his bushy, dark brown beard. I knew him, but had scarcely ever had occasion to speak to him before. He even stopped his little filly when he heard me cry, and when I rushed up to him and seized his plough with one hand and his sleeve with the other, he saw how terrified I was. "It's a wolf!" I cried, completely out of breath. Instinctively he jerked his head to look around, for an instant almost believing me. "Where's the wolf?" "I heard a shout. Someone just shouted, 'Wolf!'" I babbled. "What do you mean, lad? There's no wolf. You're just hearing things. Just take a look." "What would a wolf be doing here?" he murmured, reassuring me. But I was all a-tremble and clung to his coat even more tightly. I suppose I was very pale as well. He looked at me with an uneasy smile, evidently concerned and alarmed for me. "Why, you took a real fright, you did," he said, wagging his head. "Never mind now, my dear. What a fine lad you are." He stretched out his hand and suddenly stroked my cheek. "Never mind now, there's nothing to be afraid of. Christ be with you. Cross yourself, lad." But I couldn't cross myself. The corners of my mouth were trembling, and I think this particularly struck him. He quietly stretched out a thick, earth-soiled finger with a black nail and gently touched it to my trembling lips. "Now, now," he smiled at me with a broad, almost maternal smile. "Lord, what a dreadful fuss! Dear, dear, dear." At last I realized that there was no wolf, and that I must have imagined hearing the cry of wolf. Still, it had been such a clear and distinct shout. 2 or 3 times before, however, I had imagined such cries, not only about wolves, and I was aware of that. Later, when childhood passed, these hallucinations did as well. "Well, I'll be off now," I said, making it seem like a question and looking at him shyly. "Off with you then, and I'll keep an eye on you as you go. Can't let the wolf get you," he added, still giving me a maternal smile. "Well, Christ be with you. Off you go." He made the sign of the cross over me and crossed himself. I set off, looking over my shoulder almost every 10 steps. Marey continued to stand with his little filly, looking after me and nodding every time I looked around. I confess I felt a little ashamed at taking such a fright. But I went on, still with a good deal of fear of the wolf, until I had gone up the slope of the gully to the first threshing barn. And here the fear vanished entirely, and suddenly our dog Volchok came dashing out to meet me. With Volchok I felt totally reassured, and I turned toward Marey for the last time. I could no longer make out his face clearly, but I felt that he was still smiling kindly at me and nodding. I waved to him, and he returned my wave and urged on his little filly. "Gee up!" came his distant shout once more, and his little filly once more started drawing the wooden plough. This memory came to me all at once, I don't know why, but with amazing clarity of detail. Suddenly I roused myself and sat on the bunk. I recall that a quiet smile of reminiscence still played on my face. I kept on recollecting for yet another minute. I remembered that when I had come home from Marey, I told no one about my adventure. And what kind of adventure was it anyway? I forgot about Marey very quickly as well. On the rare occasions when I met him later, I never struck up a conversation with him, either about the wolf or anything else. And now, suddenly, 20 years later, in Siberia, I remembered that encounter so vividly, right down to the last detail. That means it had settled unnoticed in my heart, all by itself with no will of mine, and had suddenly come back to me at a time when it was needed. I recalled the tender, maternal smile of a poor serf, the way he crossed me and shook his head. "Well, you did take a fright now, didn't you, lad?" And I especially remember his thick finger, soiled with dirt, that he touched quietly and with shy tenderness to my trembling lips. Of course, anyone would try to reassure a child, but here in this solitary encounter something quite different had happened, and had I been his very own son, he could not have looked at me with a glance that radiated more pure love. And who had prompted him to do that? He was our own serf, and I was his master's little boy. No one would learn of his kindness to me and reward him for it. Was he maybe especially fond of small children? There are such people. Our encounter was solitary, in an open field, and only God, perhaps, looking down, saw what deep and enlightened human feeling, and what delicate, almost feminine tenderness could fill the heart of a coarse, bestially ignorant Russian serf, who at the time did not expect or even dream of his freedom. Now tell me, is this not what Konstantin Aksakov had in mind when he spoke of the advanced level of development of our Russian people? And so, when I climbed down from my bunk and looked around, I remember I suddenly felt I could regard these unfortunates in an entirely different way, and that suddenly, through some sort of miracle, the former hatred and anger in my heart had vanished. I went off, peering intently into the faces of those I met. This disgraced peasant with shaven head and brands on his cheek, drunk and roaring out his hoarse drunken song. Why, he might also be that very same Marey. I cannot peer into his heart, after all. That same evening I met Emke once again. The unfortunate man. He had no recollections of any Mareys, and no other view of these people but "Je hais ces brigands." No, the Poles had to bear more than we did in those days.